Welcome everybody to this event, which is part of Garden Court's week of celebration of International Women's Day. We've turned it into a week. I think that's appropriate, and I can't think of a more appropriate and better person to be having a discussion today in celebration of International Women's Day than Madeleine Rees. You will have seen from the invite and from the information that we sent out that Madeleine has had an exceptional career, perhaps spanning 30 years. And I can say that I've been very fortunate as both a colleague and a friend to work with Madeleine over that time and to see some of the amazing work that she's done, both domestically and in particular internationally, focusing on the rights of women and children, seeking to always put them at the front and centre of policy, of law and practice, and has done that in a way in which I think people recognise is trailblazing. If it accounts for anything, it was recognised by the Queen when she gave you an OBE in 2014, but I think that's probably the least important recognition that Madeleine has had. And it really has been her life's work, working, as I said, as a lawyer in the United Kingdom, and then moving on to her work with the United Nations in Bosnia and then in Geneva, and most latterly as the Secretary General of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, that you have been central to and a key person developing a feminist notion of peace and security, a feminist foreign policy, seeking to address the issues of our day from the perspective of women and girls. And of course, we're in an environment at the moment where it hasn't been more needed. We know that there's many conflicts around the world, and that women and girls and their experiences are at the forefront of concern in terms of human rights and denial of fundamental freedoms. And we need a language and a way of looking at the world from the perspective of women and girls to engage at this critical time. So I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to discuss with you. We're going to work through your career and to see how you got to where you are now, and have some discussion about the current situation as well as the way forward. Obviously, we have people online, and you're welcome to put your questions into the chat, and I'll try to incorporate them as we go along. Otherwise, we can deal with them at the end of the discussion. I'm also happy for anybody who wants to contribute and to raise any issue as we go along to do that. I'm wanting it to be an interactive experience, your opportunity to raise issues that are important to you and things that you might know about Madeleine's work or what she tells you. So I think maybe we could start off with where you are today, the Secretary General of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. That's a very old organisation, 1915, I think one of the first feminist organisations. Maybe you could tell us about that organisation, first of all.
Well, first of all, I've got to say thank you for having me here. And obviously, the thing you should learn is always have your best mate introduce you, because then you get a particular version of the history. But thank you, Steph. Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. It wasn't really a feminist organisation, because I don't think I don't think feminism had actually been put forward as a term in 1915. They were all suffragettes, and I think that was phase one of what our iteration understanding of feminism was. I mean, an incredible bunch of women who decided that in the midst of the First World War, they would somehow get themselves over to The Hague to draw attention to the root causes of the First World War, with the aim of trying to stop it, of course, but to draw attention to the slaughter on the Somme, which was going on just 50-odd miles away from where they were actually holding their meetings, which is quite insane when you think of it. And you know, women didn't have passports, they didn't have a vote, they didn't have smartphones, they couldn't communicate. God knows how they managed to get over 1,300 women, including from Australia and India and the United States. And most of the Brits were blocked, but some managed to get 200, managed to get around the outside somewhere. And what they came up with at the first meeting in 1915, and then subsequently at the Congress in 1919, has been the root cause of everything that has happened for WILPF since, and an evolution in thought which we've been able to really capitalize on as circumstances, context change, but the basics have not. And they said, and their diagnostic of the First World War was that it was caused by inequalities between people and between nations, militarism as a way of thought, the arms trade, and the privatization of the arms trade as something that going forward would lead to and exacerbate the economic inequalities which caused those discriminations in the first place. And they were so right. They were so absolutely right. And if you think of it with those pillars, that's exactly what we've been doing ever since, really, is to try to come to terms with that idea of security being militarized so that everything, resources go into militarism, the privatization of arms companies, which then create a capitalist economy or contribute to a capitalist economy, which basically ensures that those discriminations continue and the profits of conflict goes back into the profits of conflict of capitalism. And so we go on, mutually reinforcing. And of course, it's highly gendered, highly gendered. And so it's with that we have, I think, a series of Secretary Generals, and myself being the last in a long line for the moment, have tried to push those forward. And the way in which we've tried to do it since I've been Secretary General has really been to try and bring law to the centre of everything we do, particularly human rights law, but looking at principles of convergence under international law. How does law and how can law inform social progress towards sustainable peace? That's the short version.
And obviously, I think that's an important start for any International Women's Day discussion, is always to think about how we gain from and benefit from the women who went before.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's something that we should always recognise when we have these discussions. And you've ended on law as central, but you didn't start your career off as a lawyer. You trained as a teacher. But in 1990, you did qualify as a lawyer. And I wondered if you could explain how you made that change in your career.
Right, I thought law was too hard. So no, I did actually believe that fundamental change could be made by being a teacher, especially if you were a games teacher, because that's the most important thing you be, right? Physical education. But I had always from the time I was old enough to be able to, I had volunteered in rape crisis centres and worked with people on domestic violence. So I'd had an exposure to law and seen how institutionally discriminatory it was to try to give support to women going through a process. Was really quite a learning experience, because I had no idea it was going to be as difficult as it was. How naive was I? So I had a glance at it and thought, this is something we've got to change. But very long story short, I was going to do a PhD, went to Argentina with the idea of doing some basic research onto that, but of course it was under the generals, get involved in human rights, start thinking, got to work with the feminist organizations, working with feminist organizations, and didn't quite get around to doing the PhD. But then fast forward several years, and then went to Nicaragua with the idea of reviving the PhD, which is identification and alienation within revolutionary movements. From a gender perspective, thanks girls, back to the kitchen after Revolution 1, that sort of thing. And so we'd met women from AMLI before, and so they had invited some women from Birmingham, which I was one, to go to Nicaragua because they were having such incredible issues of domestic violence, sexual violence against women by returning Sandinistas, and despite the fact they had been absolutely central to the revolution. So I went and I spent quite a bit of time talking with them, and one of the things they showed me was the extremities of violence that women were being subjected to, and we were discussing the whole what was being done in Europe to overcome such things, what's being done in relation to rape, as with the same conversations we've been having in Argentina, by the way. And then they were in the process of rewriting the Constitution, so they invited me to sit with them whilst they were reflecting on what needed to go in the Constitution. And one of them said to me, he said, "Why aren't you a lawyer? You'd be so much more use to us if you were a lawyer." Oh, thank you. But she was absolutely right. And then they went on to explain their vision, because they were saying, we have fought long and hard to get our independence, and it was a women-run revolution, and it was. And we believed in equality. We believed that we would end up in a situation where the sort of violence that they'd shown me would not happen. And it's not true, it's a lie. Unless you deal with the structures of power in ways which lead to equality and you embody it in law, change will not happen. And they said, what we need is international feminist lawyers who will work across nation states together to make sure that we get international law which reflects the lived experience of women who need to claim rights underneath it, and then we can do it, and then we'll have the solidarity, and then we can make it happen. And I thought, that is amazing. You know, what a fantastic thing to be proselytizing. So being very obedient, I came back to Britain and requalified as a lawyer. It wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be actually, but apart from the accountants, solicitors, I had to do it. So yeah, so that's how I ended up being a lawyer. And then of course you've got to get into every single boring case that they ever give you while you're learning. And then, but I was lucky because I was older. And because I had done a lot of work in rape crisis centres, because I've been involved in the feminist movement in Birmingham, I was sort of known. So I started getting cases, referrals on domestic violence and those sorts of issues, so almost getting straight sucked into an entry point, which enabled me to go back to what I thought was needed in the early days of volunteering at rape crisis centre. So that's how I got into it.
So I think one of the organisations that you worked with was the Women's Legal Defence Fund, but also then with other organisations like the Commission for Racial Equality and the Equal Opportunities Commission, as they then were now obviously subsequently become the Equality and Human Rights Commission. So there was always very much a focus on discrimination. This is obviously international women's rights in one country. You're starting off in the UK, so you started off looking at domestic work, obviously, but it very quickly led to cases that were not directly focused on women's rights, but in fact about rights for people who at that point had no rights or very limited rights to protection in law, people who were lesbian, gay, bisexual, and also trans people. And just in terms of how that developed as part of your practice from what had obviously been predominantly focusing on the rights of women and girls. So how did that kind of come out of that background?
Totally bizarre set of circumstances, really, because I was practicing in Birmingham, doing a lot of tribunal work, employment discrimination. That was the main focus, and that's how I met her, because that's where we started doing some work together on discrimination. And then I got a phone call to see if I would take on a particular case of a trans woman, only called transsexual at the time, because this was 1992, 93. And it had come from barristers' chambers in Birmingham. And the reason this person wanted to see me was because I was a feminist. And I thought that's really interesting because a lot, let's not go there right now, but the antipathy there has been over trans and feminism. But this person believed that a feminist would believe in equality and would fight hard to represent someone who was suffering as a result of that inequality and who identified as a woman. So I met this one. I wasn't sure, to be absolutely honest, I wasn't sure how I was going to react to this, the whole situation and whether I would take the case or what have you. It was just so obvious. It wasn't, how things move in your mind. And you just say, well, this is a person who needs the support and they've absolutely got this right to have it, and clicked immediately. And I think it was 5 law firms that she'd been to try to get support, and everyone black letter lawyers backward looking. This is the advantage of being an older person coming into it from a different perspective, because I was never very good at looking backwards. I always wanted to look forward. So if the law wasn't right, then the law had to change. That was the thing. So the law was totally against us in terms of the sorts of rights that she was claiming. And so we had to have it changed. And isn't that rude of me not turning my phone off?
And we know that ultimately that led to a landmark case in 1996 when the European Court of Justice held that a trans person who is discriminated, denied work because of their gender reassignment, that was unlawful sex discrimination. Obviously, domestically, we incorporated those provisions as gender reassignment discrimination, although in Luxembourg, it had to fall within the Equal Treatment Directive, and that was recognised to be sex discrimination. It didn't matter that a trans person who of the opposite sex would be also discriminated against. They moved away from that very formalistic, narrow notion of equality that was in our own domestic law to a much more wider recognition of based on respect and dignity that is integral to equality. So that was P&S, and out of that, how did that impact then on other work that you were doing?
Well, it was interesting because we thought, as we got the referral to Luxembourg, again, looking at the binary notion, the comparator that was being addressed, and this idea of there being a continuum of protection that was needed, so everybody had the right to protection. That was the basic premise. It doesn't matter what the labels put on you. You can't get away from protection by labeling someone as being outside of the law, because no one's outside the law. So that was the basic premise of it. At the same time, we just kicked it off to Luxembourg, and there was the headline in the press about the gays in the military being dismissed, and how incredibly expensive this was, because it was the pilots who cost millions and that sort of thing. And so a group of us got together to discuss it with lawyers, of which you one, came to discuss what was the best way of doing this. Could we actually think of piggybacking on the nature of the pleadings we've done in P versus S to bring a case for discriminations on grounds of sexuality to the court in Luxembourg, or was it a straightforward human rights case that needed to go to Strasbourg? And really, it was a question of, well, let's see what happens and unfolds in the domestic courts first, because we had to do it by way of judicial review, which of course is not easy. And so basically that's what we did. And so I got involved. I did the Smith and Grady cases, those two. And that was fascinating in and of itself, because obviously one was a man and one was a woman. And it became very obvious to us that the comparator they were using was, they were deliberately trying to make it look as if we get rid of anybody whose sexual orientation is not heterosexual, because they wanted to play off one against the other. They could not discriminate against or get rid of gay men if they didn't get rid of lesbians. And it was very obvious that what they were doing was that they only cared about gay men. The whole argumentation they put forward was all about perceptions of gay men and the fear that there would be because they do frontline duties, because they do hot bunking in submarines. Because of that, they reckoned it would undermine performance and morale. But lesbians, no, they weren't allowed to be frontline at the time. They did all the service provision. They were nurses. They were, they did the boring stuff to keep the whole military thing going. That's a whole other conversation as to whether we actually wanted to go that direction, the equality and all that sort of thing in terms of serving. But that was the obvious fault line. But they knew it. We found a memo that they'd actually written saying we have to be careful about the lesbians. But the way in which they did it was absolutely horrific. I mean, it was like the witch hunts. They used to go through people's address books and go then and interview the people who were in the address books to see if they were also gay or lesbian, or if they got more information. If they literally get another 7 and dismiss them. They would lock people up. They would, really, it was very degrading the way in which they treated them all. And in the end, long story short, of course, we ended up having to go to Strasbourg. I had left by then, so the cases were finished in Strasbourg without my waving and clapping from the side. Well, I was waving and clapping from Bosnia by then. But the argumentation was completely solid in terms of this was a fundamental violation of rights. It showed how the military are very clever in playing one off against the other. David Panic wouldn't run that argument, by the way. So I took him off the case and we gave it instead elsewhere. And it was a bit too late to run it, but I think it might have had more clout had we really prioritized that dynamic from the beginning. And, as you know, the rest, as they say, is history, that the bans were lifted and compensation ultimately paid. It's a great costs, personal and financial, and how ridiculous for military.
Well, I think there's been a recent sort of inquiry, not an official inquiry, because in fact lots of people haven't been compensated even now, really 20, 30 years later. But obviously the importance of that case its headline is because it ended the discrimination against gay and lesbian people in the armed forces, but it also had a wider benefit because the Strasbourg court also ruled that judicial review principles were not sufficiently robust, didn't have a proportionality aspect to them, and so were not compatible with the convention. So that was a huge benefit that bringing that case had for everybody seeking access to the law whose rights, private life rights, were interfered with. So I think that's probably an important thing, isn't it? Your work is discrimination based, but it's very often that bringing cases on behalf of minority groups actually benefits the whole of society in terms of the outcomes that can arise.
I could jump in because that's a really important point, because the way I've always looked at it, if you've got one, it's like looking at a membrane. Law is like a membrane, right? There's things that have to happen, and then you pick the part that's thinnest so you can go through. And then that will open it up for everything else. So all those other areas of law, I mean, like with the P versus S, we won on a particular principle in a particular case in a particular way, but then everything else opened up after that. Basically it was right to access healthcare, appropriate healthcare, and birth certificates, and everything started falling away. Prisons, the whole thing, as a result of that one case. And you know what? Nobody cared. I mean, we did. And the people affected cared, but the Daily Mail and others, they were bits of oh look what's happened. But Joe and Jane Public, I don't think they really. It was just okay, yeah, this is fine. And now look where we've gone instead. But at the time, it was. I really think it was a totally socially accepted understanding of what human rights need to be to protect people from violation, which was really quite important. And the same with the gay cases. And so that opened up for looking at other areas as to what was right and what could be allowed. Gay marriage flowed from that. So I think there's a lot in terms of how these things gradually start building a social system which is much more progressive than was there before, and using law to do it, and using the building block of law to do it is something that I think is really, really important. So always looking up and seeing what's next and how you can do it and how you set up one case for the next one. I missed that actually.
But you did move on from that kind of case work, although obviously you would take that experience with you. And in 1998, you then moved to Bosnia, and you were employed by the head of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and were recognised as a gender expert in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Obviously, that was after the country had been in turmoil and civil war. And how did you move into it from your domestic law practice? Well, although obviously it had a very big international law element in the end, we had to go to Strasbourg and Luxembourg to get the answers. We hadn't got them domestically. But how did that transition take place?
Why? That's a very good question, because if I actually have to think, why did I do this? I don't know. But whilst we were doing all these cases and very domestically focused and law focused, Bosnia was happening, and it was like Gaza now. You saw it every day on the TV, and then the stories, but the evidence of the mass rape that was going on, and it sort of pulled me back to the Nicaraguan conversation. And at the time, the ICTY had been set up, so there was a huge interest in whether or not and how rape would be prosecuted in the ICTY. And I got involved with the idea of providing humanitarian aid. So I met women at conferences who then said, do you know Christine Chinkin, that brilliant professor of practice, a professor at LSE, who had written the amicus brief on how to interpret Rule 99, which is the rape shield law, in the ICTY. Met her, found out that there were going to be problems in actually getting this properly implemented. And then out of the blue, I got a phone call from women's organisations in Bosnia saying, will you come to Bosnia and explain the ICTY to us, because nobody has. And this was 95. So the conflict had just ended, literally, because it was November 95 it ended. And so early 96, I went to meet with them. And it was quite incredible, because there we were, all these women, and the work being done was by Medica Mundial, then Medica Zenit, so became Mundial subsequently. And they had, in the middle of a conflict, gone and set up the equivalent of a rape crisis centre with a hospital attached. It was quite phenomenal what they had done. And all done from feminist principles. It's been started by a German gynecologist woman, feminist, who'd just gone there just to support. And from that, I learned so much anyway, and I gradually kept on going back and going back. I was a partner in a law firm by then, and they kept saying, you know, partners don't just naff off every couple of weeks to go and do stuff in. So make a choice, you know, pick a lane, girl, I think. So I ended up going because I got asked if I would join the ombudsperson first to do discrimination, to look at discrimination, how it was unfolding in Bosnia, because of course it was all about discrimination. And from there, that's how come I got headhunted to go to join the UN, because it was seen that there was no gender analysis whatsoever in any of the work that was being done by the international community in Bosnia, and it was the international community which was effectively running the place. So there was huge need to get that in. So that's how come I got sucked into doing all that. I hadn't intended to. There we are. I did.
And obviously that was part and parcel of a project and a development of integrating women's experience of war, conflict, persecution into the human rights protections. So as you said, one of the important things that happened in the ICY relating to Bosnia was to treat rape as torture, rape as a crime against humanity, and it was done on that way. And again, it's, you know, this is not that long, this is your lifetime, but those were the steps that were being taken at that time. It also reflected other work that was being done with refugee protection, so that women were being protected and falling within the refugee definition of social group because of gender-based violence. They hadn't been before that. So this was quite a big time in international law, where women's particular experience of persecution and harm was being recognised within the framework of those legal mechanisms. But was there a sense at that time that this was a moment when things were beginning to open up, or how did that feel?
It did feel, I mean, it felt that clearly was because of the legal approaches that have been taken and the brilliant women who were prosecuting the cases, really fantastic feminist prosecutors who were determined to establish the nature of rape as a crime, and then the women who went and testified. That was huge. But also huge was the treatment that they had in the way in which they had to get there, and the stigma that was attached to it, and the consequences for them upon their return. And also the big lesson I think that we were all learning was that from the very first time I went and had that conversation with the women at Medica, they didn't understand why women weren't coming forward to testify. And it was because, you know, women were too busy looking for their missing husbands. War just ended. Where are they? Where's partner? Don't know, live, dead, missing. How are we going to feed the kids? Where I'm going to live? You know, everything. There was nothing left, because most of these people who were benefiting from the services that had been displaced, some would come for an afternoon, some would stay. You know, it was all very random. But why weren't they going forward? And it was because of that. And so the point was, we then set up a legal clinic attached to this so that they could get advice as to where you need to go to ICRC. That's where they're people who are registering missing people. You register your kids with this part of the international community. This is how you make sure that you register for your apartment back or your property, so that they could have something which was essentially all about human rights. This is how you access your human rights. And once you've done that, once that was more stable, that's when women started to come forward. But it was often a year, 2 years later, if at all, you know, because in terms of the numbers, but it shows absolutely the necessity of providing that sort of support and providing a context of security, which tends to get forgotten when we throw women into courts to go and testify. And so many of them say, you know, they would much rather have done it closer to home without having to go and get planes on the same plane sometimes as the lawyers of the perpetrators, and down and on. So there's an awful lot of lessons learned, an awful lot learned, but, well, an awful lot of lessons. I'm not necessarily learned all of them. But at least we know better now what should happen. The other thing I think is really important to mention is so many of the women I met in Bosnia who had been subjected to rape, so many of them said that was not the word, not the word that happened to them, and yet it was the only thing that people cared about. You know, many worse things happened, and yet they were not given that justice in terms of the recognition of that harm, because why actually? You know, why was it? You know, why is it still? We have this emphasis on sexual violence, and let's go back to Gaza and see the report that came out yesterday by Pramila Patten. You know, why is that the report? Why is it the Israeli government was insisting on having that, and the timing of it, and the instrumentalization of women from Israel who probably were subjected to that, and the insulting way in which they've thrown it back at the rest of us, saying, you know, what have we ever done? So I think there's so many ways in which sexual violence has been instrumentalized as a property, and it starts with international humanitarian law and how it's portrayed. But anyway, digress, sorry.
Might come back to that. So having gone there with that purpose in mind, it must have been a pretty shock to find that actually whilst you were working within the UN in Bosnia, one of the big issues that exploded was the incidence of trafficking. Sorry. And more shocking even still was the involvement of international forces, including UN forces, other international representatives who were present in Bosnia as police or as military. They were actually involved in the human trafficking of women and girls for sexual exploitation and other forms of exploitation in Bosnia. And one of the things that you were obviously got a high profile for was standing up and saying this is wrong. And how did that come to your attention?
Amazing, she was quite early on, because the work I'd been doing with Medica, which is the Rape Crisis Centre, so-called. One of the people who'd been associated with them was a judge, and she came to me in 97, 98, I think it was, and she said, don't know what's going on, but I keep on having women from Moldova, Romania, Ukraine come before me as a judge being prosecuted for prostitution. And she said, I have no idea how they've got here or anything else, but I have to, as a matter of law, deport them from the canton, which means they get kicked over into the next canton, but then they come back again in a month's time. So I don't know what, and I thought, oh God, this sounds like trafficking, but it seemed like it was small and contained within a particular area. But we started asking questions around it, and within a few months, we had been able to determine that it was widespread, that almost every spy, by 1999, I think it probably was, it was pretty obvious that there were places being used for forced sexual exploitation in almost every village. It started off at petrol stations and as you'll see it to film the whistleblower, in locations which are set up outside of the main cities, which proved absolutely that it was the international community using them because there was a curfew and people didn't have cars. Basically, very few cars were still working. So essentially, it was the international community who were using those places, and then it spread. And it was a lesson learned in some respects, because sexual exploitation happens in every single peacekeeping context. There is not one where it has not been. Trafficking in Bosnia was bigger than the sexual exploitation, because it's more than sexual exploitation, because it actually involves a financial exploitative element which feeds absolutely into organized crime. There are literally millions of dollars in suitcases in Bosnia at the time. I mean, literally being shipped out with it. And it was one of the main industries which helped to destroy the economy, or any potential economy that Bosnia had, because you've got at the beginning, 80,000 peacekeepers in Bosnia, 80,000, most of whom are men, most of whom are military, and they can act, and they have a form of immunity. And so they thought they could do what they liked. And essentially, you got the fall of the Berlin Wall, so you'd got impoverished ex-Soviet satellite states where there was real poverty, and migrant working was seen as a way out, and a massive recruitment, very easy to get young women to go to travel, to sort of go to Italy, to Germany, to Greece, to work in hotels, to work as hairdressers, whatever. So they were conned, literally conned. And I actually spoke with one of the first women I spoke to in traffic. She said, what happened to Germany? Did they not rebuild after the Second World War? Because you've been astonished at the level of ruination that there was in the drive that should come from the border. But I mean, there's an awful lot we could say about this in the modalities of and everything else of it. But it was very clear that this was happening, that it was a market-orientated enterprise. It was extremities of capitalism, if you like, moving goods to a market, which was obviously the internationals, raking off huge amounts of money off it, paying off the officials so that everybody turned a blind eye to their money. So, you know, corruption, all the rest of it. And then creating entire local industries dependent on it. So you then can't break it up. You know, the taxi driver, the bouncer, you name it, the fixer, they were all implicated. And of course, it's entirely gendered because women had very little at first to do with it. Plus the detrimental impact on the domicile population. I mean, they wanted it stopped. And at first, there was very little support for the work we were doing from the local population, save for some incredibly brave women's organisations who were exposing it, because they thought this is all an international problem. It's foreign prostitutes, it's foreign men, it's got nothing to do with us. And it was only when they realised, you know, what was really, really happening that we got a lot of support to try and stop it. But it was absolutely shocking, and the lack of interest from the United Nations itself, you know, the nod and the wink to boys will be boys, was absolutely the way in which they wanted to deal with it. They did not want it surfaced, and it's only because Mary Robinson was High Commissioner for Human Rights at the time that I wasn't dismissed then, because they did take steps to get it removed. So she wouldn't let it happen, which is pretty good.
But the person who became the figurehead who was dismissed for raising it was a woman called Catherine Bolkovac, and she wrote a book about her experiences, and there was a film made about it too. It's called The Whistleblower. If you have never seen it, it's released in 2010, and it gives you this whole background. And you're played by Vanessa Redgrave, I think. I don't know who's more fortunate, her or you. You. But
He's a famous one.
It's hard to imagine because we're so used to the framework that's been established to protect victims of human trafficking, and there was literally nothing.
There was nothing.
And so I think, although obviously it was a huge cost to Catherine, whose career ended because she challenged this within the US situation, and others, and we'll go on to talk about how it impacted on you. It was quite an important part of the movement that led to the framework that we have now to protect trafficking victims.
Yeah, it was. I mean, there was a whole trafficking task force of the Stability Pact, and became the OSC. So there was a lot of law being done in order to try to get this cross-border elements of trafficking and smuggling put in. And it's the Transnational Organised Crime Convention, its protocols, which we drafted the last bits for anyway, and then had to try and get implemented through human rights law in order to get that applied. And then to get the accountability to try to move away from this idea of there being immunity for peacekeepers and others who are in somebody else's country to do what they like, basically, without any form of justice being available to women who needed to obtain it. So that's work in progress. 20 years later, still not quite got that one cracked, because they're still not wanting to annoy troop contributing states and employees of the United Nations and others. So
yeah, well, we've got a government that is intent on removing the protections for people who are victims of, or possible victims of trafficking and modern slavery, so that the protections that were established have been disapplied under the new Illegal Migration Act, if and when it comes in. But so that's taken you right up to your work, because what we kind of missed over there is during that period you were promoted to work under Mary Robinson as the head of the Women's Rights and Gender Unit in the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, and then you were then in Geneva.
Yeah.
And so in terms of, people who, of course, the UN is a vitally important organisation, but it obviously has limitations, and you've indicated that, you know, one of the consequences for you of this role in standing up against the involvement of international forces in trafficking was that ultimately you were dismissed, and a court went on later to find unlawfully so. So how did that work? How did it work that despite the work that you've been doing, you ended up losing your job?
Too outspoken. No, I think it's interesting because whilst I was in Bosnia, I was the head of the Office of High Commission, right? So my job was to hold them accountable for everything. There was the rendition case, we should mention it. And so there's all the different departments of the agencies of the UN that had press conferences. Basically what was happening was there was a 6 Bosnian Algerian background who were basically rendered from Bosnia to Guantanamo Bay after a lot of court cases we've been involved in to try and prevent it happening. We'd won all the court cases to stop it happening, and they stuck it in the middle of the night and grabbed them basically and sent them off. And Mary Robinson, again, champion, I told her what was going on, and she said, I want you on the record all the time, whenever possible, and I've got you, you know. So I did. So I was very public about that, and how very interesting that, you know, they did a press conference and all the other agencies would leave the podium. So it was just me, you know, so they wouldn't, so the solidarity was not there. They didn't want to say, oh, naughty America, look what you've done, or naughty Britain, look what you've done. And we ended up going to the then Human Rights Chamber, which is the highest court on human rights in Bosnia at the time, international judges, and took the case and won it, which is the first rendition case. I think actually that's the very first of the rendition cases, of which there were then many. But of course, that really annoyed several people because I had named them as having been complicit. We didn't put it in the pleadings, but in my introductory remarks, I actually said the case is against Bosnia, but in fact, these are the organisations and these are the people who gave the orders. We've got it documented, we know what happened. So that was all a bit sort of politically inconvenient. And so when I got to Geneva, there'd been a change of regime and Mary Robinson had unfortunately moved on. And we had a couple of people who were wanted to stop that sort of human rights activism within the system. I mean, as simple as that. I know that it was told me subsequently that the head of the Department of Peacekeeping Operations had actually demanded that I be dismissed because I had embarrassed the Department of Peacekeeping Operations and because I hadn't shut up about it. So, you know, and they say, oh, when someone like that says something like that, then, you know, action's got to be taken. So, you know, it didn't work out so well in as much as difference between working in another country and where you have got autonomy. And I did have a lot of support within, you know, from the government of Bosnia, surprise, surprise, we were extremely supportive of what we were trying to do and did try to give us the right sort of solidarity. That when you get to headquarters, it's different because it's way more political. And there was a huge move to move away from the Mary Robinson style of claiming the independence of the mandate of the High Commissioner as being the highest authority on human rights, which was amazing. And she'd used it so strategically and well. And she protected those of us who went in behind her, if you like, or who gave her the information that she would stand by. That changed because Ban Ki-moon, the then Secretary General, didn't want that. And he had instructed those at the Office of High Commissioner to subordinate the mandate of the High Commissioner to the Human Rights Council. So it really was a secretariat to a bunch of states sitting in the Human Rights Council, so it became political and state-led rather than law and human rights-led. And I think that's where my views and that of those who would sort of undermine human rights parted company. So we parted company.
And the beneficiary of that was obviously WILPF. Because then you became the Secretary General of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And obviously now I'm going to talk to you about the work that you've been doing since and that you're still involved in now. And looking at issues of peace and security from the perspective of women and girls, from a feminist perspective. How would you say, what is it? What does feminist peace and security look like?
We don't know because we've not seen it
Yeah.
anywhere. I mean, that's the problem. And to imagine it is difficult because we are so steeped in our structures and our ways of being and our understanding of what security is and what peace looks like and who draws up peace. So it's very difficult to fundamentally rethink it. And it's almost as if you've got to have this vision of what, you know, a place with unicorns and rainbows would look like. And yet it's absolutely possible. Because we've done a lot of work in Syria, and just a simple example, we conceptualized with Syrian women what were they doing on the ground in the midst of the conflicts? They were doing what women have done in every single conflict. They knew who the players were. They knew who they had to talk to if they wanted to know where the prisons were and how they had to help to organize prison swaps. They knew that who was bringing in the guns, where they could stop the guns coming in from. They knew how and in what way they needed to be continuing an education for the kids, which would actually bring within it, don't pick up guns. They brought human rights into the curriculum in the middle of the conflict. They were taking guns off, returning, those who were returning from immediate conflict. They were doing an incredible amount to try and create secure environments within the communities. And so the point is that to come and give support to that, to help to build that, with the idea of creating an organic piece. You get one little bit of the puzzle, and that starts working. And then you move to another bit, and it starts expanding, and it looks different. And a lot of it was done with it. There was art involved in all of this. There was media involved. There was training. There was the equivalent, I would think, sort of the Syrian equivalent of consciousness rate. How do we actually understand what it is we need to do? So that the social reproduction was absolutely core, crucial to doing that. It wasn't able to expand far enough and fast enough because it wasn't given the right support. But what if that had happened? What if in every single conflict we start with that and we're able to actually inject that sort of support in the right way to those women who are doing it, which is every woman in every community. I saw it in Bosnia. I saw it in Argentina, I saw it in Nicaragua, and I traveled right the way through Latin America to get to those places as well. And it was happening in every single community. Women were holding stuff together when there were coups, where there were general strikes, never surfaced, never valued, never seen. And yet if we saw it and we valued it and we put that into the creation of that transformation, it would be different. So concretely, what would it look like? Say Ukraine. If we want to take Ukraine, Gaza, or Sudan, the three really hot ones at the moment, what would it look like if we tried to make that happen? And we're actually talking with women from Palestine at the moment on just that, because what to do, how can women in Gaza particularly organize and do things now? And yet they are, and supported by women in the West Bank. What they are saying is, first of all, obviously there's got to be a ceasefire, but they've had enough of men from all over the world, not their own men, making the decisions for them. And women, as you know, has taken the brunt of in both conflicts, both in Sudan for sure, to a certain extent in the civilian population in Ukraine, but massively in Gaza. I mean, 70%.
70% women and children.
Yeah, 70% women and children. How is that even thinkable? And so the redress has got to be, women have got to be front and center of any changes that are going to happen. It's no good the World Bank and others saying, now we started our reconstruction plans just after October the 7th, because that's going to be that wonderful neoliberal mechanism they put in place for Bosnia, which they've already designed for Ukraine, which is going to institutionalize the structures of power which discriminate against women and prevent the possibility of sustainable peace. Because it will go back to the WILPF thing. Inequalities between people and between nations, it will do that all over again and create a capitalist, again, it's a disaster capitalism. So what if we put women front and center? What if they are the ones to decide what must happen, how it must happen, how it should be funded, how it should be distributed, by whom, when, and in what way? Now, it sounds ridiculous, but they know already. we've spoken to women in Ukraine. They know already what needs to be done, but never allowed to have that knowledge actually put into a political process. Now, the one thing I think we can all claim, credit for in some respects is that we have got the laws now. We've got them. The whole point of the Women, Peace and Security resolutions was to try to make sure that we embodied human rights law through security rhetoric to try to ensure that women were participant in post-conflict prevention. It was prevention, protection, and post-conflict reconstruction, so that we could say, "Oi, we've got a law here which says we've got to be here, so we're going to be here." It's never been fully respected by any of the negotiators. Maybe you know this, but it's never happened. We need to change that. And we're actually really seriously making a push for it now in Geneva, because so many of the ambassadors there are saying the same thing, which is, we sit as ambassadors in Geneva, wringing our hands, watching this horror, and we can't act. Well, they can, because basically it goes back to what we're saying all the time. It's got to be about law and human rights as an entry point for security. And once you've done that, you're moving away from geopolitics and militarism. And so if we could do that, and we are strategic in our funding, then I think we've got the beginnings of a change. It's like building that organic piece. We are, in fact, in the process of actually devising what the legal obligation for that participation is, what should happen, a political economy analysis, gender perspective, all of those things, which of the IFIs are supposed to fund it, where's money supposed to come from, you name it, it's all there. And now we've just got to force it to happen, because I'm now very bored with being a supplicant to male bastions of power. We've been doing it for way too long, and we have to rethink how we make these arguments. And I think it's really just to say we've got law on our side. And the ICJ decision, I think, really helped enormously. It showed how scared of law the Israeli government were, because they immediately had to go and cheat, by throwing something else in as a distraction, which everybody chased for a while. And now we're coming back to, well, what's this really mean? And the other states are now starting to join other states as parties to that case. United Kingdom hopefully will be in the dock soon as well. So there's many, many things that we can be doing. But fundamentally important, I think, is what, when we look at the pushback against all the things that we've been able to achieve as a matter of law and practice, which has been huge over the last 30, 40 years. We stand on it and think, well, look, we've done, but it's like standing on sand. You look down and think, well, actually, there's no nutrition coming here, and it's because we've been starved of the economic opportunity, the economic investment that's needed to sustain that. And that's because of austerity and because of neoliberalism. So back to the other pillar of wealth, that economic systems of exploitation have to go. And so then if you go back to what should states be doing, and we have many with feminist foreign policies. And I love Chile right now, my best state, because they're doing wonderful work on feminist foreign policy. They're actually articulating it in ways which I think are really comprehensive. And they've got a great ambassador in Geneva who's totally feisty. But one thing we could do is every government should have a Minister for Peace. How simple. Everything that happens that's done with your trade agreements, that's done with your defence agreements, that's done with your education system, has to go through that lens just to see, is that contributing to conflict or is it contributing to peace? So, when local authorities are now saying got to slash their inclusion and non-discrimination budgets, well, Birmingham, what if you'd done that right in the first place? You would have gone bankrupt, because you wouldn't have had your equal pay claims, would you? So, it's about looking upstream at prevention rather than, where we go now, which is always a default position. Oh, bad things happening, we better militarize to get security again, and off we go again. So there's so many things, there's so many opportunities. And it's really about looking up and seeing where that connection is, both as a matter of law and policy and practice, and where your solidarity can come from. And when we reach the tipping point, which we're at now, I think we're at a tipping point for sure. The UN is either going to survive this, or it's going to completely collapse under the weight of its own hypocrisy. And we can push to try and make sure that it's the law and the human rights and common humanity, if you like, which actually tips us in the right direction.
Yeah, so I suppose is the important thing about law and human rights that it's universal, that it transcends state power, and it cuts across that, because it obviously is that you see with the UN bodies that they don't act and they don't move because they're tied up in the interstate relations. Obviously, that's the Security Council. They can't do anything because of the balance. But it is that what's important about law and human rights, is that it is a mechanism that transcends national interests and interstate relations.
It should be. But states cheat by not paying any attention to law, as we have seen. Right? But that's the importance, I think, of all of us doing law, is that we don't stop just because they cheat. We have to look at principles of convergence. We have to be more intelligent and outmaneuver them and find ways of picking them off. And you did that with the cases you were doing in those demonstrators against the companies that were providing arms. There's things that can happen locally, which can then start something which then takes care of one part of it, but sets a precedent as to how we can then use our own power to make changes. So it's cumulative, and once we start, as I say, start putting all those parts of the jigsaw together, and we really start moving things. So yes, I think it is possible. It takes long. I mean, it's long. I mean, how long have I been doing it? It's a long time now. But actually, I've been doing it a long time, and Will's been doing it even longer. But in fact, in terms of acceleration of progress, it's not half bad. We think it came from Beijing that big strides were happening, and then it was Vienna, and then it was the Security Council resolutions on women, peace, and security. That's 20 years. Yeah. That's not bad. Now we're going to make it work.
Yeah, and I suppose the thing that you said about being built on sand, that's the most important thing, because what we're realizing, certainly domestically, is lots of things that we'd established or that were taken for granted. For example, refugee protection, entitlement to come to the UK to claim asylum, that has now been ripped apart by this piece of legislation, obviously for political ends. So it is about how you hold on to the gains that have been made. And I wondered what you think about that. We are in many ways, we hope that the arc of progress is in our favour, but we do seem to be at a particularly pivotal moment where lots of things that have been protected in terms of the rule of law are being set aside. How do we respond to that?
Get a new government would be a good start. Lots of places could get new governments, but then make the government that could be an alternative actually do what we want it to do rather than what they think they're doing now, which is not representative either. No, I think that's got to be it. I live in France, and it's quite interesting to see what they do at local level, which is way more democratic. I think it's really boring to go and talk about the water and whatever, but it's not. And it's all very local and very much sort of everybody gets to have a say in what's going to happen in your village, and you've got your mayor. And, not to overstate the case, but the thing is, I think sometimes people feel that the law is too remote, and especially when it's being ignored by governments and changed and called the will of the people. Who asked? Who asked? Who asked if everybody wanted to have the asylum laws rented asunder, as they say, and telling people to go through that? Nobody asked. And yet they claimed it. So I think there's the exposing lies, hypocrisy, whilst it's pretending to be law, and showing it's not law. It's still the way we have to go, and then grounding it. I think it's absolutely fundamentally important that we keep doing it.
And then just one other issue, which is obviously a central part now of any notions of peace and security, has to take account of the climate issues. And I mean, is that been part of the work has that cut across your work in WILPF at all, about the role of women in the campaign for climate justice?
Totally. In fact, it was like we built on the principles from 1915, 1919 onwards, and the chapeau is the climate, because basically we can fix all of those things, but if we don't fix the climate, if we don't fix those things, we won't fix the climate. And we've spent a lot of, a huge amount now on drawing the attention to the impact of militarism on the environment. I mean, it's absolutely colossal. And what's happening in Gaza is just accelerating enormously, same in Ukraine. So instead of closing the window, instead of opening the window that was open a little bit from the climate talks, you know, they want to push it closer to being sealed forever and too late because of militarism. And the gender dynamics are huge, absolutely huge, because we've got a lot of sections in Africa and they're tracking to see, you know, what is happening in terms of localized conflict is so often driven by climate. And it's gendered. It's totally gendered again. So, you know, unless we start getting that element front and center to our understanding of how the political economy works and what then it needs to be done to make those changes, we're going to miss it. And we're going to go to a default position. And one more thing, I know we keep talking about law. We've always got to be super careful as well, because it was written by men, mainly. So, you know, it's coming from the male gaze and the way in which the institutions run. I don't have to tell you guys, you know, there's an awful lot of work to do in changing the structures. Same UN, you know, the structures are themselves binary, hierarchical, follow a patriarchal model, and to try and change those is super hard. Unless we do, we're not going to be successful. So there's a lot of stuff to be done, really, still. But a lot has been done, so I think we can be on the right track, maybe, is where.
And then, so looking at that, looking forward, you're about to retire from WILPF, but I don't think you're retiring from carrying on with the issues that are dear to your heart. But what would be the one message that you would say to the room, to people online, about, you know, from your whole experience, which has been, I hope people found fascinating, where you've what would be the one message that you give to people that you've learned, that take with you going forward?
I think it's never, apart from the very obvious, never give up. Always think it was being fascinating. Because you know, you're given these awful situations to deal, but there's always something that can be done. There is always a something, if you just look hard enough to where it's going to be. And I think that's what kept me going, even though when you think it's absolutely hopeless, but there's always something, and there's always good people, even in places where you don't think you're going to find them, that will help and will give the support. And you can build alliances. And when you've got those alliances, game on. So I think that to me has been huge. And the other thing is that I love the expression is think globally, act locally. You know, that old feminist dive, it's perfect. It's so true. We need to do both. And that's the way that we will make this work.
Maybe we can end on, we need both deeds and words.
Deeds and words.
Whether those words and deeds get written in law or not.
Exactly. Good way to.
So obviously I've got an opportunity now for you to ask Madeleine any questions that you have. If we haven't exhausted all your possible questions or interest, I hope that there's something that
you can wake up now.
Want to ask her about any of the issues that we've discussed or her career.
Two questions in one, but regarding your experience in the UN, did you ever feel unmotivated in working in an organisation that you say yourself face so much hypocrisy? And with that, do you think there's a point in, as people grow and they enter the UN, in joining that sort of organisation, when you see with Gaza and everything that there's just so much hypocrisy?
Answer number one, yeah. Well, no, I didn't ever think. When I first joined, I thought I was going to be totally amongst the brightest and best in the world. So I was somewhat disappointed quite quickly. So yes, it was sometimes, I didn't feel disengaged from it. I thought, oh, that's what it is. Okay, if it's that, then this is what we can do. Because if they're not that engaged, then we could reposition ourselves. And then I was really sneaky and I hired all good people. Case in point, who then came and worked. And we were like this gang, you know, who would be the troublemakers and human rights fundamentalists, but based on law, so no one could say anything. You know, so that was always fun and good. And that gets you through it. And it's very necessary to have people go into the UN. Very necessary to have people change it. But you've got to be a bit tough, because the system itself is so difficult in terms of, I mean, I've seen brilliant people go in there and they just shrink. And they just then become pen pushers. They don't know what's happening, they don't care what's happening, because get well paid, it's gilded cage, you know. So always be making sure you're not there for the wrong reasons, you're there for the right reasons. But institutions only change when you've got good people in them. And so I would still encourage, and there's some brilliant people in the UN. I mean, Philippe Lazzarini now, the head of UNRWA. I mean, what an amazing guy he is. He's so passionate about what he's doing, and he's never giving up, despite the fact that so many people are trying to get rid of him, and death threats and God knows what else. There's good people. There's really good people. So it's the politics we have to change, and the structures we have to change to make it so that the good people can achieve. So I would encourage people to swamp the UN with their applications to get it in good shape.
Yeah, and I suppose we can't ever forget the one legacy that came from the catastrophic war in Second World War was the international human rights instruments, conventions, and the United Nations itself. That is the testament that in writ large, to say this cannot happen again, is the fact that the world did set up these organizations that were intended, international organizations, to prevent that. Obviously, its ability to do that is in question, but we must keep that value system that it underpinned and the universality of human rights, and putting those rights into practice as a collective endeavour that is central to the UN's existence. That we've really got to hold on to and cherish and bang the drum for it.
It's the we the people part of the charter, not we the nation states.
Yeah. Any other questions? Contributions? Sarah?
Madeleine, you mentioned the World Bank and how that's coming in after and you mentioned Sudan as well. And I remember reading about the World Bank and their contribution after the Vietnam War, the Cambodia War, and how when Michael McMara was head of that, I think he was was he head of the military in America or something, and then he went to run the World Bank.
Yeah.
And he looked at Thailand that had obviously been used as the rest and recuperation part of that territory, that part of the world, for all the military personnel that were in Cambodia and Vietnam. And basically went in and said, well, we'll rebuild it, we'll rebuild this area, but it's all based upon that, you know, the sex trade.
Exactly. It was.
And that was it. And then that was so kind of set in concrete then. And they're still having problems now because of the way that the World Bank went in and just said, right, well, this is how it's all set up. Let's throw money at it, and this is the infrastructure there. Is there anything that's changed within the World Bank, do you think, or is there a force within the World Bank that looks at the situation now in Ukraine and can look at a different way of looking at that redevelopment, that restructuring?
I would say yes. The World Bank is not the most evil of all of them. I think what we've got now is a whole, because the World Bank does have sensible checks and balances within it, and it does now have much better programs. It's supposed to do the gender analysis. It's supposed to come in to make sure that it's supportive of the women, peace and security agenda. And there are some good states who sit on the board. That said, have we noticed a huge difference? I think the answer to that is that we haven't really. And that's because they never act alone. There's a very good, we're very active in Ukraine doing the diagnostics before the conflict, before the conflict, with Russia directly. And if you look at the role of the IFIs in that and how the gender impact was enormous in Ukraine. And just following neoliberal philosophy and policies and austerity and all that happened with that. And it was World Bank with goodness knows how many of the other IFIs, including the development banks, including the Asian development banks. And if you read the report of the Special Rapporteur on Foreign Debt, it absolutely epitomizes how it led to the collapse within the communities, particularly from a gender perspective. And who cares? Now, the next development plan they've got for the reconstruction of Ukraine is that one. It's the same, only bigger. Because this time you can sell off all of Ukraine. Anybody can sell off. It used to be you had to be Ukrainian to buy. They've got rid of that even. So essentially now everyone's just waiting so that they can grab the arable land so that we control the future. Great. Nice, huh? And we're trying very hard. We've done a whole critique of that. We're trying very hard to get people into it because the European Union is implicit, the EBRD is implicit, you know, and it's not thought of there's anything wrong with that. And this is the problem. You know, it's we can challenge it. We can totally challenge it. It's just that, oh, this is fine. This is what we do. But yeah, those are the problems we've got. And I think the biggest problem we've got now is the nameless, faceless hedge funds. Because who are these people? You know, and if you want to make money, just invest in the arms companies because they never lose. They never lose. There's always something that can be concocted which allows you to export more. Use them, price goes up. Use them again. It's just a vicious circle. And it's the Wilf said ages ago. It's the right hand washing the left hand. Capitalism and militarism, two together.
Yeah. I've got a question from Annabelle McKay. Thank you, Annabelle. Annabelle asks you this question. If you could give any advice to your younger self at the time when you started out in the human rights field, what would it be?
Well, that's like one of those ones off Radio 4, isn't it? What advice you give? I think it would be not to be quite so naive, because I trusted people. You know, I really did. I trusted the institutions. I thought, you know, what you saw on the tin was what you get. And it wasn't like that. It wasn't like that. So I think that would be one thing. And the other thing, I think, would never underestimate the power of the individuals within the institutions and their common humanity. I don't think I did, but I think I would emphasize that more because it's huge. You really can change a whole thing with good. You just put the heads above a parapet for 5 seconds and then you've got a question. But yeah, I think it would be a little bit less naivety. But that's just what you always say about everything, isn't it, when you get older?
If there's a bit of time left.
There is.
It's always such a pleasure to hear you, Madeleine. I was reminded, I heard Catherine McKinnon talking about, you know, we've gone from zero to a lot of law in a very short space of time. But in order to get that implemented and to do the work, I had 2 questions. One, where do you get your feminist information from? Or what's the feminist media that we should be all following, you know, particularly with the internet now being so diverse? And then your work in WILPF, but generally working in solidarity. So those of us who are based in London, how do we do really ethical work in solidarity with women in different places?
Great questions. I think we need to go back to the old mistresses rather than the old masters. You know, I mean, I do find that a lot of younger feminists haven't read the old stuff, and it's so relevant. It's so relevant now because they were visionaries as to what needs to happen and how it should happen. And I think a lot of it has been picked up on. I would say that there's the things I have been, I mean, not that she is young, Cynthia Enloe, I love her work because she synthesizes that militarism and how it works. She can explain inequalities in ways which are just incredible. And I think the work of people like Jackie True, because she really revolutionized, she and Yakin Ertak, they revolutionized, to me anyway, the whole understanding of how the political economy of violence against women works. And once you see it, you think, my God, how did I not know that? That is so obvious. And then you see how you can deconstruct it and how you could actually change it. So I think that amalgam is really quite something. And in terms of what can be done in solidarity, it's hard. It's hard because I know, like, if we're doing a lot of work with women from Iran in London, And they're all, yeah, they don't always get on. They don't, because they've got different solutions to their current malaise. But there is solidarity on the legal stuff.
Okay.
There really is. So you talk about gender persecution, you talk about apartheid, which are the new current themes, the new iterations, I think, is where we're going now. And I think this is great because it shows how we pass from ordinary everyday discrimination, which then metamorphoses into persecution when it gets bigger, and then it becomes institutionalized once you get the likes of the Taliban and the Iranian regime and Donald Trump probably in positions of power. So that, and you can see how the granularity of it actually works in practice. I think that understanding that, so we can actually apply it to ourselves as well. Yeah, everything on social reproductive rights, it's all related to that. How does discrimination work? How do they control women? What do we need to do to understand that, to give them the support? And I think it's very important not to be instrumentalized in the support that we give to, because that happens, as we have seen. We're blacklisted because we didn't immediately come down and say there was widespread and systematic rape on October the 7th. We said, no, that's instrumentalizing women, and they deserve justice, not opinion. And so I think it's things like that we have to be wary of. But importantly, I do think, certainly my lesson has been over the last 30 years is when I listen to women from Sudan saying what's happening and what they want to have happen, it's the same as I've heard from women in Bosnia, from women in Syria, from women in Yemen, you name it, Ukraine, it's the same experience. And if we could just grab this and see how those thematic issues are the things which hurt women most and destroy societies, that way we can understand better what we can do in terms of solidarity. And a lot of it's the policies of our own governments and our own trade agreements and our own investment. It's a lot of it is that. So how do we untangle all that and actually make it or understand it in ways that we can actually then change it? So it's quite a complicated answer, I'm afraid, but I think, increasingly, I see the women I'm meeting all over, they really want to tear down the flags and symbols. And they really do. And the work that WILPF does is often about bringing women together and having these convenings so that women can accelerate their own learning experience. So we took women from Bosnia to Ukraine and vice versa. So they could say, well, this is what we did, and this is what happened to us. And we're like 20 years ahead of you in terms of still trying to come through that. So don't let that happen. We took women from Syria to Ukraine as well to say, we got co-opted, and to Afghanistan, in Geneva, they met in Geneva, to say we got co-opted into becoming part of an advisory board instead of being at the core of the peace process. Don't let that happen. So lessons learned from each context, which can then be spread and learned. I think, we've got this crazy idea now that we want to create a group of women of the peace processes, from Ireland onwards, who have done this stuff and who really understand what it's like not to be taken seriously today because we're talking security, so you can't come in, girls, or to be alleged to be having an affair because you were out later than you should have been. All of the things which undermine women's ability to participate. By naming them, putting them out there, saying it happens all the time, you're not alone. And we show that solidarity. And I think that makes a difference.
Thank you. So ending on that note, which I think is obviously the most important note for International Women's Day, which is solidarity and sharing our experiences and learning from experiences for the women around us, the women that we're fortunate to work with, the women who were there before and have left their legacy, whether that's in writing or in their actions and their deeds, then we're strengthened by all of that, and that's what we can take with us into our work going forward. And I hope that it's been an inspiration as well as an informative information that you've got about Madeleine's career and her work as a advocate for human rights and for women's rights. We've got an opportunity now to carry on the conversation if you'd like to do that downstairs. But can I thank you all for coming? And thank you all.